Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure update. It's the 25th of November, so a few days late because it's the Ignite special. I was there, I did get to present a session, which was pretty cool. In fact, I think I'll take this off. And so there were just so many announcements, and I got delayed coming home because of Chicago snow. It took me a little while to get the update actually done. These are the broad areas. There's just too many updates to fit all of them within the index. So I'm trying to summarize it by the key areas so you can jump to particular areas. I did get a new video out. So we focused on the new capability to bring a lot of Azure management services to your Windows Server instances that are not in Azure, but if they're covered by software assurance, you get those capabilities for free. So I go through that in this video. And of course, my session from Ignite will post soon. There were massive technical challenges. Every time I demoed, the screen would black out. It was a faulty adapter, as it turned out. The technician was super apologetic. He, about 2/3 through, he switched it out, and he gave it to me, cut in half as a memento from the occasion. I think I'm going to get it framed, put it up somewhere. Not how hard you get hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. I think that will be the motto of that, but it should post in the next few days. So let's get to the updates, and there are a lot, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. So on the compute side, so Azure Local was announced. Now I've put GA here, but realize it's actually going to release in different waves, because think of this as the evolution of Azure Stack HCI, which is where, hey, it's built on that Hyper-V hypervisor with storage spaces direct and other Azure capabilities tightly integrated with Azure Arc. And today there's actually other features. There's like Azure Stack Edge, Azure Stack Hub. Well, Azure Local will have a broad range of capabilities from small rugged devices through to single nodes, through to multi-rack systems, including disconnected scenarios. So this is going to have new abilities added to it over time, but this is the new hybrid story. So Azure Local will bring a lot of those capabilities together. Azure App Service Sidecars are GA. So when I have my Azure App Service built on Linux, it could be container nor container based. Well, consider now if I want to add capabilities. Maybe it's networking, logging, monitoring, vector caching as we do more AI things, but I don't want to change my primary application. What this will let me do is those additional features will run in its own sidecar. Now, maybe that's its own isolated process, maybe that's actually its own isolated container, but it will attach to the main process, attach to the main container. So I now get those features available for me. Now, AKS had a lot of additional enhancements. So we have the security dashboard. So think about the integration with Defender for Cloud. So in Preview now, I'll get full visibility into the security posture of both the hosts and the Kubernetes runtimes. So I can get a good idea of what are the various vulnerabilities that may be present. Now I get automatic app insights instrumentation. Now behind the scenes, this will just inject the Azure Monitor open telemetry into my application pods, but it will bring all of that insight into what's happening inside my pods for my applications into Azure App Insights. There's now a dynamic system node pool. Now this is for AKS Automatic. So AKS Automatic simplifies a lot of the configuration decisions, my choices. So it does the setup, the resource allocation, the security to be production ready following best practices. Well, that system node pool VM SKU will now be selected automatically based on available capacities within my subscription. They've upgraded the upgrade algorithm. So today, one of the things you can hit is when I'm trying to drain a node of the pod, so you do the pod drain to get all the workloads off of it so I can then replace the node. If it fails for some reason to do that drain, it can get into a bad state and the node just gets blocked. Well, now what will happen is it will use the available surge capacity to upgrade the other nodes and basically quarantine off the blocked node. I'll then be able to come back and look at, well, which nodes were quarantined to better troubleshoot and then go and remediate them. Trusted Launch is now available for the AKS nodes. Trusted Launch, remember, uses the Gen 2 types of virtual machines that are UEFI based. So that UEFI gives us a virtual TPM. And with the virtual TPM, I can do things like secure boot. So I get that attestation from the hardware all the way through to the running operating system. So basically, it's that integrity assurance. There's no rootkit or bootkits as part of that boot chain. And now for my container insights, remember we have that newer container logs v2 single schema. It can also bring in metadata from Kubernetes. So I could get information about my pods and my images. So labels, annotations, etc. will now be present within there. For Fleet Manager, we now have improved resource placement. So if you think of Fleet Manager gives me that very large scale management across different AKS clusters that can be across subscriptions, across regions, just has to be under the same Entra tenant. Well, now if I have resources I want to deploy in place, it can schedule those workloads across all of those different clusters, depending on the individual resources that are actually available within them. We also now have extended workload scheduling capabilities. So what this is going to let me do is if I consider the idea that I want to be able to override certain changes based on cluster labels. It could be permissions, configuration, parameters. I get those new abilities to control those types of configuration based on these elements. But we also now have multi-cluster auto upgrade. So if I have the desire to obviously upgrade all my AKS clusters, well, instead of now only being able to consider upgrade of nodes in a cluster, I can actually create profiles and policies to upgrade entire clusters in a certain order based on how I have my applications deployed. So maybe it's a new image, maybe it's a new Kubernetes version, but it's going to control the order in which I update those individual clusters while still adhering to any maintenance windows I have set on the cluster itself. There's a lot more compute. So for Azure Container Apps, we now have planned maintenance in preview. So remember, Azure Container Apps abstract away the AKS, but they add features like CADA for better scaling, Dapper for better microservices, networking capabilities. Well, now I can have planned maintenance. So for the non-critical updates, critical updates will still ignore your maintenance windows because, hey, it's something that they have to just get applied. But for the non-critical updates, so think minor security patches, bug fixes, new releases, I can define a single weekly maintenance window. So I pick the day of the week, the time, and the duration. The duration must be at least 8 hours, but it will then perform maintenance within that. Serverless GPUs are available in preview. It's serverless because, well, it can scale down to 0, but also I have per second billing. And what I can do is I can leverage GPUs like the NVIDIA A100 and the T4 GPUs to be used within my particular container app. So when I go and create the container app, I'll specify the types of resource I want. So I would say, hey, I want a A100 or a T4 GPU, but then I can use that and it will scale the amount it needs. So if I'm doing things like real-time or batch inferencing, if I'm doing machine learning, if I'm doing high performance compute, rendering, big data analysis, anytime a GPU would help the workload, I can now do that with my serverless GPUs in my Azure Container app. And private endpoints are supported. Remember, private endpoints use an IP address in my virtual network as a direct path to the particular instance of that resource. So now, hey, based on that particular boundary, I can only communicate it via that private endpoint. That's for consumption and dedicated plans, but it's only for inbound HTTP traffic, not TCP traffic. And dynamic sessions have gone GA. When we use generative AI, very often it may actually go and generate some piece of code that we then go and execute to perform some function. But because it's been generated by generative AI, we don't really trust it. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to run the code that it generates in an isolated sandboxed environment. So what dynamic sessions give me is a Hyper-V backed isolated sandbox to run that generated code. Now it starts up really fast. I can access it through a REST API, it's fully managed to run this code. Today, if it's Python code, it will actually run in a sandbox interpreter session. If it's not Python, then it will run in an isolated container session where I can install the software, I can run the various bits of code it would require. I think they're going to add more beyond Python in the future for the interpreted sessions. But hey, when I have that untrusted code, this gives me that ability to execute it safely. Azure Container Instances, which give me that ability to really, it's a container as a service. I have my Docker image, I just want to run that. And I can use container groups, so I could group certain ones together in a process. But now what it's going to let me do is have a standby pool. So it's a set of pre-provisioned capacity, which I can then allocate to the various container groups that I want to spin up. So it will be available that much faster. Azure Functions has a whole set of improvements. So OpenAI triggers and bindings in preview. Obviously, OpenAI is all about the generative capabilities. Well, I can integrate with a model. I can receive instructions from a model, like I'm an agent, to go and perform something for it. I can even hook into Azure AI Search when I want to do some sort of vector operation to go and get some data as part of retrieval augmented generation. So really, it's all about now I can be part of a generative application. Agents want to go and perform things. I can respond to that, but I can also go and interact with the generative models, interact with the vectors. .NET Aspire is in preview. So .NET Aspire is really a collection of NuGet packages that have tools, templates, packages all around creating cloud-native applications. So this can be used for my isolated workload model. So remember, isolated means it's not using the same versions as the host itself. And I can use it from .NET 8 and .NET 9 projects. Speaking of, .NET 9 is now supported. So .NET 9 just GA'd, I think it was November 12th. I can now use .NET 9 again using the isolated worker model. And the new Flex consumption plan has gone GA. So this builds on the existing plan. It's still per serverless billing. I can still scale to 0, but it includes things like integrating with VNets. There's a whole set of additional capabilities. The DCA and the ECA v6 SKUs are now available in preview. So these are based off the AMD confidential virtual machine. So it's the 4th gen AMD EPYC processors, and it encrypts the entire VM. So with the Intel SGX, we have the secure enclave that we have to really change our application to work with. With the AMD secure encrypted virtualization and the secure nested paging, the entire VM is encrypted, so I don't have to change my application at all. And the goal around these V6 SKUs is it's really a better price performance compared to the previous versions. Obviously, the DC is that general purpose when you think of the ratio of CPU to memory, and the EC is more memory focus. You get a higher amount of memory per virtual CPU. And additionally, just the regular. So the DAEAFA V6 SKUs, again, AMD 4th gen EPYC processors available. D is the general purpose. There is an L variant of the D series, which gives me a low memory. So it's a 2-to-1 ratio compared to the normal 4-to-1 ratio of memory to CPU. Obviously, E is memory optimized, an 8-to-1 ratio of memory to CPU. And then the F is compute optimized across various ratios and a whole set of improvements over those previous generations. Still on the compute. So virtual machine scale sets. Now you have resilient create and delete. So there can sometimes be failures when I try to create. Well, then it will automatically retry the operation. There can be failures when I try to delete. It will retry the delete operation. So it's really about removing manual effort when things go wrong. And it also will be used to heal if something is found to be in an unhealthy state. There's now custom metrics can be leveraged as part of rolling upgrades for my virtual machine scale set. So the custom metrics will leverage the application health extension to control which metrics it's emitting. And I'll then use that to control the order in which I perform the rolling upgrade. So if I want to have more control over the order based on metrics my application is emitting, I can now do that. Flex standby pools has gone GA. So once again, ordinarily with virtual machine scale set, when it scales out, it will go and create a new instance of a virtual machine based on whatever the configuration is. It may have to go and install things into it, warm it up. So it takes some time. So as it scales, there's a delay in it actually being useful. So what standby pools do is it lets me go and pre-create some instances, pre-provision them, run any scripts that have to run, install any software. Then I can either leave them running or I could deallocate them, but they're basically pre-created. So then when I have to scale out, it can be brought into the VMSS that much faster, will be available that much faster, making that need for additional capacity to be a lot more responsive than the normal way. So it's really about removing lag during those scale operations. Zonal expansion is now in GA. So if I had a regional deployment, I can now switch it to a zonal deployment. I can even add additional zones to an existing deployment. So with virtual machine scale sets, we say, hey, create this VM scale set, use zones 1 and 2, for example. Well, now I could say, well, and also add zone 3. If it was regional, hey, I'm now switching to particular zones. And if I switch from regional to zonal, or zone redundant rather, I can move from a 99.95 to a 99.99 resilience. Because obviously AZs, because of their independent calling, network, power, control planes, give me a higher resilience than if something was just running in a specific cluster. Max Surge is GA. So again, when I perform upgrades of a virtual machine scale set, normally we just do a rolling upgrade where, hey, if I had 4 instances, we take one of them, basically goes out of usage, it's drained and cordoned, so I lose a quarter of my capacity. It's upgraded, then it's brought back in, then I go and replace the next one, etc. What Max Surge does is it adds new instances once they're up and running based on the new image and the configuration I've specified, and it gets workloads, it just goes and deletes old instances, which means there's never a drop in capacity. I have control of this. I can control what percentage it's doing for each of those various batches. I can control if there's how much the delay is between the batches, but it just gives me ability to upgrade without any drop in scale of my VMSS. There's now flex upgrade policies in GA, so I can control. Is it automatic? Is it manual? Is it rolling? Automatic, I have zero control. It may do them all at once. I have no say in that. Manual, I have to go and choose when to update, which is good when I need really fine granular control. But most often you'll use rolling, which is very good for production, but I still have control of those batch sizes, etc., to ensure I'm still meeting a certain amount of capacity to perform the work. Azure Compute Fleet now has attribute-based VM selection and multi-region deployment. Remember, Azure Compute Fleet is all about very large-scale VM deployments and management. I can have up to 10,000 VMs in a fleet. And what I used to do, well, I still can, is I would say the VM SKUs I want. Well, instead of saying the VM SKUs I want, I can say the attributes of the VMs I want. So I need this many vCores per VM. I need this amount of memory. I need this amount of storage. And what Fleet will now be able to do is pick the VM SKUs that best matches the attributes you need, which is really useful as you think about new versions and new types of SKU are released. It might be it might be able to now pick a better version of that. And the multi-region simply means those deployments can now be across regions, so I can bypass any particular regional constraint that may exist. Azure Migrate has a number of updates. Primarily here, you're focused on the idea of a very detailed total cost of ownership. So it will compare what's my current TCO for running where I am compared to if it was running in Azure. And this would include things like Azure Arc functionality, so Defender for Cloud, Azure Monitor, Azure Update Manager, extended security updates, SQL Pay as you go. It can help build in all of those different costs available so you can understand, hey, would this be a better fit to go and move that to Azure? And for Azure Backup, we have secured by default in preview. And this is about the idea that now just by default, even if I delete a vault, it will be retained for 14 days. So it gives me protection from, hey, there's some bad actor, they want to do bad things to your environment, so hey, we're going to delete your backups, well, I'll be able to bring them back for up to 14 days by default. I've covered this before, but the immutable worm storage, the idea here is once a backup has been enabled and locked for immutable, there's nothing you can do to delete it or reduce its retention time beyond what was set when it was created. Now, you want to be careful with this because once you do enable and lock it, there's no way to shorten that period. So obviously I'm going to pay for that retention of the storage. So you would normally start off enabling it first, make sure you've got it right, and then I can go and enable and lock. So it's saying to experiment, but it gives you that additional assurance that people can't do things to your backups. And then AKS regional DR is GA. So now my AKS, I can back up to the vault. I can restore cross region. I can even have long-term retention up to 10 years. Still more compute. So for logic apps, I can now use Azure DevOps to build and deploy. So in my ADO pipelines, I can very easily go and deploy my standard logic apps. Standard now has deployment slots in GA. So this is really useful. If I've got an update, I can go and deploy it to a new slot, I can validate it, then I can switch that slot to become production, then I can go and delete the old deployment slot. If something goes wrong, I can always switch them back again. So it's a really nice no downtime solution as I need to roll out changes. The premium SKU integration account has now gone GA. So that's really about those business-to-business integrations. It has higher limits. It has VNet support for private connectivity, has availability zone support. Standard now has templates available. So think of these as just pre-built workflows for those most standard types of scenarios. And they're just available via the Logic Apps Designer. Consumption plan now has AI capabilities. So this is about connectors. So it has connectors to Azure AI Search, which is really useful, remember, for that retrieval augmented generation. I need to go and get some data based on natural language that's the nearest neighbor. Has connectors to OpenAI for that generative. Hey, here's my prompt. I want you to go and generate me my response, that inferencing. And also forms recognizer. So it makes it really easy to integrate from the consumption plan. And also now we have the hybrid deployment model in preview. So this lets me basically run on my own infrastructure. It's built off Logic Apps standard, meaning any of the built-in connectors that execute run within that particular local compute. So really good for accessing local data, for example. It's still using the Azure control plane. Azure extended zones now adds Los Angeles. Remember, the extended zones are really smaller footprint Azure locations in particular metros or particular industries. It offers a very small subset of the services like VMs, compute, storage, maybe a few other services. But where I want that more local, lower latency connectivity to those services, hey, this can be a good option for that. VM spot placement score is in preview. Azure Spot is a way that where there's that spare Azure capacity, I can utilize it at a reduced cost. Obviously, Azure has to have spare capacity as people scale and create workloads. We'll let you use that spare capacity at a reduced cost. What this lets me do is work out via the placement score, what's the likelihood of success when I want to go and provision my Spot deployment. And then there were a number of hardware announcements. So the Azure HSM, the host security module. Now, the new servers that get built actually have a special slot for a hardware security module. So that's going to make sure any cryptographic operations I perform that I perform locally stay in hardware. They stay always encrypted, always secure. And then also for Azure Boost, there's the DPU, the data processing unit. So as I think about storage interactions, database to storage interactions, it's going to be able to improve the performance of those by offloading more and more to hardware. On the networking side, so Azure Bastion now has SSH connectors in the portal via Entra ID. So if I want to do an SSH connection to a resource via the portal, I can use Entra integrated authentication. So I don't have to use local authentication to go and connect to that resource. And also there's now the premium SKU is available. Really, the premium SKU adds two things. The first is session recording. So when I'm actually going and making that connection, it will record everything on the screen to my storage account. Now, it doesn't record the keystrokes, it doesn't record the audio today, but it will capture everything happening on the screen. And also I can now connect to the Azure Bastion using a private endpoint, i.e. an IP in my VNet. It removes any public IP usage, which is really important for some customers. App Gateway for Containers. Remember, App Gateway for Containers, although it's got App Gateway in the name, was really a built from the ground up solution, specifically built to be native to Kubernetes, controlled via Kubernetes without any Azure specific knowledge for the developers. Well, now that solution can still integrate with the web application firewall to give you that protection from known malware, protection from bots, etc. And then they've introduced this idea of the network security perimeter. Now, this is, I think, really, really cool. Most PaaS services, obviously, they have a firewall. And that firewall, you can control who can talk to them, but you're doing it on a per instance basis. And also, if you have different PaaS services, like a database and a storage account, well, you have to do these sometimes kind of weird things to let them talk to each other, but not other things. I'm worried about data exfiltration. So what the network security perimeter lets me do is define this perimeter, and then I can put resources in it. And this includes support for things like Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Database. So then the things within the perimeter, these PaaS services can talk to each other. I can also define rules that say I'm allowing specific input or specific output to traverse the perimeter. For example, I could allow private endpoints. But it gives me now a single place for the management and the audit of all of those resources. Now, what I can do initially is run it in a learning mode. So I can create the perimeter, put the resources in it, and just put it in learning mode to see what the interactions are, what the input and output is. And then once I'm confident I understand the needs, and I go and create those various policies to allow the traffic that needs to pass through it, that should pass through it, I can then put it in enforce mode to restrict it to only that and deny everything else. Network interface IP address block support is in preview. Now, normally, if I have a NIC, I have an IP configuration, and the IP configuration has an IP address. What this lets me do is instead of having an IP address, I have a IP address block, which can be a /28, which means it would give me 16 usable IP addresses. So it's a 16 times improvement in the number of IP addresses I can have on the network interface. So if I have certain workloads that are kind of IP address hungry, or maybe, hey, there's certain port exhaustion going on, well, now I can have 16x the number of IPs on a per IP configuration basis. So that's going to be really useful for a number of workloads. Azure DNS has a number of changes. So fallback to internet for private DNS zones. So the idea here is you sometimes get into this scenario where you have different private DNS zones, so the records in them are different. So if I try and do a resolution, or if I get an NX domain, so a non-existent domain record, I can't find the result, well, that result would get cached and I can't retry and I get stuck. I can't access the resource. What this will let me do, if I can configure it, if it gets that NX domain result, it can go and fall back to the public DNS records because it now has a different DNS resolution path. There's also now DNS security profiles. So this lets me at a VNet level define the DNS traffic I want to capture. So I can say the particular domains, the particular actions I want to capture, and I can send them to the normal culprit. So it could be a storage account, Event Hub, Azure Log Analytics workspace. And then DNSSEC support. So this is all, and this has been around for a really long time, but it's about signing the records, signing the zone. Because one of the things that happens today is people can try and poison the DNS cache you may have with records that point to the bad place, or you just get some person in the middle that tries to return the wrong result, sending you to the wrong site to do bad things to capture data. Well, if I sign the records, it doesn't work because I can't sign it in the way the legitimate owner of that zone can. So it gives me that protection from that cache poisoning from that person in the middle trying to send me to somewhere else. So now we support the signing of those records. API Center now has API analysis in GA. So remember, API Center is more of that development time API solution. And this lets us automatically evaluate and assess the API definitions we have, make sure they align with my organization style, the quality I require. I get detailed reports. I don't have to do anything. There's no management I have to do here. I just get these capabilities. And then API management is more of the runtime capability. So my request to APIs actually go through this API management. And so now we have the premium V2 tier, which is really larger scale, unlimited numbers of API requests, full VNet isolation. The generative AI gateway token quota policy has gone GA. So that lets me have quotas daily, weekly, monthly. It gives me full visibility. It gives me cost control of how many tokens I'm using with my various generative AI models. They've added support, that should be GPT. They've added support for GPT 4.0 because the API management, they test it with specific versions of the models. So now it's supported to use GPT 4.0, both text and image for all of those capabilities. So that's policies to control the use. It's emitting metrics for the use and caching of the various interactions. There's now shared workspace gateways in GA. So a workspace lets me enable different developer teams to manage their own APIs. And historically, they each had their own gateway, which has a certain cost associated with it. Well, now I can have multiple different workspaces sharing a gateway, which really helps me optimize my spend. And the Copilot in Azure now has networking capabilities. And this is actually all about just helping me understand the networking, helping me architect the networking, helping me troubleshoot the networking, all through just that natural language type interactions. I can ask it questions. Hey, why can't I get to my VM? And it would go and look at, well, what are the NSGs? What are the UDRs? Hey, I want to make this more resilient. Well, hey, you should go and X, Y, Z. So it's just a nice way to get the help with your network types of interactions. On the storage side, so Azure NetApp Files for its large volumes now has call access tier. So for that most infrequent data, I can go and move it to a lower cost tier. And Azure Container Storage has a number of performance enhancements. Remember, that was built specifically for AKS, and this is now for the ephemeral model. So if I'm using that local NVMe storage in the nodes, I can get higher IOPS. That's both with or without replication. Excuse me, I'm going to have to get a drink. Okay, so on the database side, so for MySQL Flexible, zone resilience is now enabled by default. So even if I don't do high availability of the service, the underlying storage for the data and the logs will use zone redundant storage, which means, hey, if something does go down, a zone goes down, it can go and recreate and connect to another instance and spin up as required. MySQL 8.4 long-term support is available. So if I need to stay on a version for a prolonged period, I can do that. Also, MySQL 9.1 innovation is supported. So that's where I want to get the latest features and start utilizing them. On the PostgreSQL Flexible, Apache AGE Graph is available in preview. So this is all about having very powerful graph database capabilities, specifically graph RAG. So we used to retrieve augmented generation and the ability, we have the semantic index with the vector database to go and find, hey, the semantic meaning and the closest. Well, graph, remember, is very good about understanding the relationships between entities. So what graph RAG does is where there are those more complex relationships between data, it will still enable me to find those best matches that regular RAG and vector databases may miss. So I can now leverage that. On-demand backup is in preview. So normally you have a regular scheduled backups, but now I can additionally perform an on-demand backup. Maybe I'm about to perform some type of operation. Maybe I need an instance as is right now to go and copy it and do something else with it. So I can now create these on demand. I can delete them whenever I want. So that is now available in preview. And again, I still have the regular scheduled happening there. There's a solution accelerator specific to legal research using GraphRag available. Again, really in research scenarios. Disk ANN indexing is available in preview. So I'm going to talk more about the Disk ANN, but this was created by Microsoft Research for this really high performant type of indexing and finding those closest neighbors for your workload. So that's available now for PostgreSQL Flexible. I can now use the managed identity for PostgreSQL to talk to Azure Storage. So imagine I want to do a database, a copy command to blob. I can now use a managed identity, so I don't have to have any other kind of token to talk from Postgres to my Azure storage. I now have elastic clusters. So this really is performing the sharding for horizontal scale. So I can manually do that. I can manually shard my database and manually worry about where the data is. What this does is just managed by the service. So it reduces what I need to do and will just shard accordingly. Semantic ranking, solution accelerator is available in GA. So semantic ranking helps improve the accuracy of the results. And what this solution accelerator actually does, excuse me, it deploys an Azure machine learning semantic ranker and then exposes it via a user-defined function that I can then call from my SQL query. The upshot of that is that semantic ranker model performs a re-ranking of the results I have and sends that back to me. So overall, I get the most effective data sent back. Index tuning is GA as well. So this looks at what are the most resource-intensive queries, what indexes should I go and create, what indexes should I drop. It's all built on the query store, so I can now leverage that. And also the Oracle forwarding extension has gone GA. So where I have an Oracle database, I can now interact with its data via foreign tables in my PostgreSQL database. Also, it's not on here, but the Azure Data Studio migration extension for PostgreSQL has been retired. Just use the migration service in the portal. And then for Microsoft Fabric, now there was a lot of Microsoft Fabric announcements. Again, review the book of news for Ignite. But I think this workspace monitoring was a pretty big deal. So I can view the diagnostic loads, the workload metrics at a workspace level now. So it's going to be really useful for both the developers and the administrators. And I can hook into that via an Event House KQL database. And then Fabric databases. So today I can think about, I have IaaS SQL solutions. I put SQL Server in an IaaS VM. I have PaaS solutions, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL MI. Well, this is really a SaaS solution. So I can create a Fabric database. I have a SQL endpoint as usual, but what it also does is on the back end, it's asynchronously, but it's in near real time, maybe a couple of minutes, that may shorten. It will replicate the data into the OneLake. So remember, the OneLake is that Delta Parquet open format that all of the different analysis engines of Fabric use. So now I have this SQL endpoint for my transactional interactions, but I can still, almost real time, then go and perform analysis against the data without me having to do anything. And all of the replication, the resiliency is just handled for me. So that's available in preview. And then the OneLake catalog. Is GA. So think of this as the ability to go and find and explore the data that's available in my OneLake. It gives me governance capabilities like data lineage, protection, recommended actions. There are also a bunch of Custo enhancements, like new operators in preview, and in GA it had the star pattern. And then a bunch of things for Cosmos DB. So for my NoSQL instances, there's full text and hybrid search available. So for the text, think of this as tokenization of the text. It has a best match 25, BM25 text ranking, which helps based on the number of times certain phrases can be found in the data. Then it has hybrid search, which combines BM25 with a vector search. It's things like Azure iSearch does this. And then it uses a reciprocal rank fusion, RRF, to combine the BM25 text search and the vector search into a sorted list of overall best matches. MongoDB vCore instances now have a data API. So ordinarily to interact with the MongoDB, I'd need particular drivers or software to interact. What this does is I can just use a REST-based API call, essentially abstracting the details of the MongoDB from my application. All my app has to be able to talk is a HTTP REST API, which anything basically can. I don't have to go and add my own abstraction layer to that. Also, MongoDB vCore has a change stream. So for those inserts, updates, deletes, I can subscribe to the change feed, which could then drive event-driven applications to go and perform something based on those actions. Also, that vCore MongoDB instance has auto-scale. So I only pay for the resources I need based on the amount of workload it has to perform. Also now, secondary user role-based access control. So I can have more granular permissions where I have that secondary copies of the data and give them only the access to only the data they specifically need. So as an administrator, I get the full controls, and I can then go and grant these people a much more smaller subset. There's now a Linux-based emulator. So if I'm on Mac ARM 64 or x86, as a Mac developer, I can now use this Linux-based emulator to locally develop and test the various things out. There's also actually a VS Code extension for Cosmos DB when we talk about developers. Vector search for NoSQL. So once again, just more basic, different options available for performing the index and finding nearest neighbors, but also the disk ANN, like we talked about earlier. We have that ability for both NoSQL and MongoDB to use that Microsoft Research created very high performance, very low latency, very high accuracy ability to find the most relevant data available. MongoDB vCore also has cross-region replication now in GA, so I can have a replica to another region, asynchronously kept up to date, and I can always make it the read-write copy file over to it via a promotion if required. For SQL MI, there are now instance pools. So what this really lets me do is today there's like a minimum size I can create an Azure SQL MI instance, which may be bigger than I require. With an instance pool, I can put multiple SQL MIs into it, which can be as small as 2 vCores. And I can create new instances into that. I can move existing SQL MIs into it. And really it's about, I would go and create a new instance pool that has a certain amount of vCores, that would have its own maintenance window. And then I can create or move those instances into the instance pool that will use that capacity I created. I can also mirror to Fabric. Obviously, this is becoming a bigger and bigger thing where I have data in other places, but I want to be able to use the analysis capabilities of Fabric, where I can now mirror into that OneLake, that Delta Parquet format. Also, Azure SQL Database can mirror to that OneLake format in Fabric. Azure Managed Redis was announced in preview. So there's an existing Redis solution, but what this is going to be is even more price performant using the newest capabilities. Obviously, it's providing that in-memory cache we use for a lot of applications with up to 5 nines availability. Now, obviously, there was a huge amount of AI. Azure AI Foundry was announced. Think of the Azure AI Studio will be rebranded as the Azure AI Foundry. So that's where all of the different models are available. So I can experiment with the models. I can compare models. So I could have models side by side, give it a prompt and see how they respond, how timely. It can help with the fine tuning where I have my own set of data. I want to tune a model. It can help evaluate the quality of the responses. It has things like Azure AI Search, the safety capabilities. There's an SDK. Really, today there's a huge number of tools available for AI. The goal of what they're trying to do here is create a single place where I can go and perform those various interactions. Obviously, there was a huge amount of Copilot. I mean, Copilot is really becoming, in a lot of ways, the new interface to everything we're doing. We went from text interactions to GUI interactions to now these multimodal, so it could be text or image and audio and video in a natural way with these things. So they announced a whole bunch of new role-based agents, new capabilities of copilots. But the whole point of the agents is they can now just autonomously perform functions around some business process. So an agent performs a single business process. So what you'll probably end up doing is having hundreds of agents eventually, all going and doing these things, and they can talk to each other to perform a more complex stream of operations. And the goal of this is you should be able to create them as easy today as I can create a rule in Outlook. So you go and create an automatic rule. So, hey, if a message comes in, do this thing. But this would spread across the entire estate. There were also lots of Purview announcements. Think of Purview as the governance for AI. So things about better classification and finding the data, finding maybe abusive use of copilots against our data, labeling data specifically to not use it with the copilots. Just again, bringing all those capabilities together. And then miscellaneous. So Windows Server 2025 hotpatch is in preview. So obviously Windows Server 2025 went GA, huge amounts of improvements. VMs with 240 terabytes of RAM and 2048 virtual processors. Hotpatch was previously available in the Azure Data Center version of Windows Server, but now it's available on premises in multi-cloud for standard and data center. Now it does require Azure Arc, but the big deal here is reducing the downtime. So instead of a monthly maybe reboot, maybe it's a quarterly reboot. There's less binaries you have to update, and it can hook into Azure Update Manager for that patching if you require. So really it's about just reducing the friction to get those patches deployed. Azure Deployment Environments had a number of updates. Remember, this is the basically templates for particular types of project to quickly spin up the environment with all the required app infrastructure. So this integrates with the Azure Developer CLI. So I can do things like AZD up, provision, deploy, but it's not just ARM templates anymore. It's other infrastructure as code frameworks. That's a big deal. I can also now have pre, post, and delete scripts executing as part of this. And I can use private networks, can be used for that compute runner now as well. The Azure Security Baseline for Linux had some updates. Really, it's just about more accurate, more detailed compliance. It can have auto remediation. A number of event grid updates. So in GA, the MQTT broker has custom domain names. I can also have namespace topic push to webhooks. So something comes in, I can push it to a webhook. In preview, it had a cross-tenant delivery to another event hub. Service bus, storage queues using managed identity and federated credentials. I can also do a namespace topic forwarding to a different namespace. Confidential clean rooms are in preview. So this is all about the idea where I have different parties wanting to collaborate, but they don't want to share their data with each other directly. So imagine I had financial institutions and they want to be able to share what financial actions their customers are doing without sharing the individual customer details. So the clean room lets them collaborate on some set of data without being able to see each other's data specifically. So if I have PII, health information, these are really powerful for those multi-party type collaborations. So go and check that out. Entra license now has a new utilization portal. So if I go into usage and insights, there's a license utilization. Today it's only Entra P1 and P2, but it's going to grow over time. I can also hook in via PowerShell and just see what I have and how it's being utilized. And then Windows 365 Link was shown. I remember in the old days, you used to have these thin clients, which were specifically dedicated just to go and connect to a remote VDI. Well, this is some very small form factor, fully managed, locked down, just to connect to Windows 365 and give me a very rich experience. So that will be available, I think, next year. And that was it. Again, a huge update. I do recommend check out the book of news. It has good summaries of everything, has links to more detailed blogs. Go and check out and watch the sessions you're interested in. But until the next update, take care.